And now we come to 1948. Before we come to 1948, my time is up. I have 17 minutes and I'm not even in 1948. Themes: Islamic betrayal, Arab betrayal. Not betrayal in the direct sense, not literally betraying me, selling me out, but just weakness.
That's the second one, right?
That's function. This is a theme of Palestinian history at every turn. Arab weakness, Muslim weakness, and the desperate desire to be redeemed from that weakness. That's what drove Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam. That's what makes Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam an extremely minor figure who didn't live very long and had no successes, the Hamas hero, because it was an Islamic story. He came and he said Islamic honor is the heart of the story. And he taught an Islamic piety that will be our redemption. Islamic weakness from Rashid Rida through Haj Amin, through Izz-ad-Din al-Qassam, is at the heart of the Palestinian story. It's a theme of how Palestinians think about us. Imperial patrons. I want to do imperial patrons as well. We saw how the fact that we were Russian in 1882 matters as much as the fact that we were Jews. Before there was a standing proper Zionist movement, being Russian was the fear factor toward us, because they're Ottomans. And so there's always an imperial patron. That imperial patron is replaced by Britain. Incidentally, there's an intervening period where it's replaced by Germany, when Jews start leaving Germany and coming here in some significant numbers in the 1920s. This is something I think we talked about on the podcast. There's a debate among the Jews. The Technion is being founded, the great Israeli Technical University in Haifa, and there's a big debate, 1920s, over whether or not it should teach in German or Hebrew. Now, why would you teach in Hebrew? Because Zionism. Why would you teach in German? Because you can't do science in Hebrew. In 1920, you cannot do quantum physics in Hebrew. Well, if you can't do quantum physics in Hebrew, you better teach in a language that you can do. And Palestinian newspapers, including Palestine in Jaffa, cover this debate among the Jews. And what's fascinating as they cover it is they think that it's a debate between Jewish Hebrew nationalism and the German imperial connection that these German-speaking elites of the new Yeshuv have. It's a debate about identity, which among the Jews it's not. It is in a different sense, because what can we do with Hebrew is what kind of new society we're building. In that sense, it's an identity debate. But it's not a debate between loyalty to Zionism and loyalty to the Germans. That is not what it is. But there's always an external patron. There's always an outside force. In 1948, that debate about the outside force reaches the British Parliament, Egyptian Parliament. As the Egyptians declare war in 1948, this is an account of an Egyptian politician who, you could find this in Alex Jacobson and Amnon Rubinstein's book, Israel and the Family of Nations, and he has all the sources. When in May 1948, Britain withdrew from Palestine and the first Arab-Israeli war broke out, one of the reasons that Nokrashi Pasha, the Prime Minister of Egypt, gave in Parliament when asking for a declaration of war from the Egyptian Parliament was that Israel was the vanguard of world communism. He cited the kibbutz movement to press his point. Both houses of Parliament voted for war against Israel, quote, in defense of Arab rights and against communist atheism and nihilism. Why would the Jews be the vanguard of communism? What a silly thing for Egypt to think. Yes? The kibbutz movement. Why else?
Mortify Marx.
Well, I mean, a lot of Jewish communists, but why else? No, but I want to hear the Czechs. Yes?
The Russians voted to the state of Israel.
Yes, but why else? So did Chile. Why else?
Czechs supply arms.
They're literally funding, they're arming the Jews. The main arms supplier at the beginning of 48 to the Jews is a direct order from Stalin through the Czech Republic, through Czechoslovakia, to arm the Jews. The Jews have a huge problem with armaments. And their main arms come from the Soviets at the beginning. What do the Soviets see in the Jews?
Communist state.
Hopefully a vanguard of world communism. And without the communists, they couldn't have. And so when the Arabs talk, I'm not saying that this did, when the Arabs talk about us, there always has to be, and by Arabs I mean generally the Arab world, whenever they're in conflict with us, there always has to be a patron. By 1956, not very long after this, 8 years later, who's the major arming agent of the Egyptians? The Soviets. The Egyptians are being supplied by the Soviets with all the guns to destroy the Jews. But in 1948, the actual declaration of war is against the vanguard of communism, which would have surprised the Palestinians who are still convinced it's British imperialism. Remember Algeria? 1962, the FLN victory. 1964, the PLO. What's the theory behind the FLN victory?
You make the cost of being there too high. It's significant acts of violence.
And then the Jews, once you terrorize them and the cost is too high, they leave. Where do they leave to? The Pale of Settlement in 1962? Where do they leave to?
I don't think they thought that far.
Whoever will take them, maybe? By 1964, when the PLO is founded on the FLN model, half the Jews of Israel are what? From? The Arab world. What's the great tragedy of the PLO founding itself on the model of the FLN? That as the French all leave, who else has to leave? If they'd noticed what happened to the Jews as the FLN come to power, they would have been less convinced, I think. But they don't notice what happens to Algeria's Jews when the FLN comes to power. So they're convinced that they don't notice that the story of the FLN and the Jewish flight in '62 from Algeria is the invalidation of the very strategy that they learned from the Algerian FLN experience, right? But part of the story that I didn't tell you with Algeria, and you will read in Alistair Horn, is 1956. In the '56 war, that is a war that Israel now sees itself in existential dread. It's, by the way, very similar to this moment strategically, which is a piece I'm now writing for the Times of Israel, so make sure to still read it and click on the ads. In 1956, the Jews, 8 years after 48, suddenly awakened to the fact that they are surrounded by a new Arab nationalism led by this guy named Nasser, supplied and funded by the British. In 48, the Arabs were essentially chaos, poorly armed, poorly trained, profoundly uncoordinated, could barely field armies of any value in the field. By 1956, that was no longer true. And so part of 56 was an attempt to push back this mortal threat that the Israelis suddenly see in this new Arab nationalism. But what did the Arabs see? Who helped the Israelis? Who asked the Israelis to conquer Sinai in what we call the Kadesh operation? The British and the French. And the French forces that arrive in Sinai don't get to fight. They have to turn right back around because of Eisenhower. But the French forces that arrive in the Sinai, where are they from?
Algeria.
What? Algeria. Are you connecting the dots? Because if you're Arab in 1956, you can't not connect those dots. So what is Zionism?
Proxy of others.
Okay, we thought it was communism. We thought it was, it's definitely now still British and French imperialism. Because now the communists are on our side. Because third world. 1962, when the FLN then drives the French out of Algeria, the connection is already so deep that it's what we say in Hebrew, mitbakesh. It's hard not to think that Algeria is Palestine. You'd have to make a conscious effort not to come to that conclusion because the connection is so consistent and so deep. And we are finishing up. I'm finishing intentionally in the 60s, and I'm going to now in 10 minutes rush through the rest of it. Okay, so I will talk longer. No, we're going to try and have a few questions. Yasser Arafat at the UN gives a speech in 1974, introduced by, that's by the way him at the Brandenburg Gate in like 1971. That's him with Soviet backing and support in East Germany. Yasser Arafat at the UN in 1974 is introduced to the podium of the General Assembly by the President of Algeria. Exactly. Who was also a leader of the FLN. And he's introduced to that podium and he says, read the speech. It's online, it's translated, read it. We live in a time of glorious change. An old world order is crumbling before our eyes as imperialism, colonialism, neo-colonialism, that's the cool kind of colonialism from the Matrix, and racism, the chief form of which is Zionism. The important thing is that there's a lot of isms. Ineluctably perish. Good translator. We are privileged to be able to witness a great wave of history bearing peoples forward into a new world that they have created. He is wearing a gun. And he is talking about all the anti-colonial movements and the retreat of all the great Western empires. Of that, in that world, just causes will triumph. Of that, we are confident. The question of Palestine, sorry, apologies to Shalem College, belongs in this perspective of emergence and struggle. Palestine is crucial amongst those just causes, fought for unstintingly. Let's pretend I did that right. By masses laboring under imperialism and aggression. What is Zionism?
Racism.
I mean, all of them. Why? For all the reasons we learned. Is he an idiot? Is he a crazy person?
Very fast.
He's a mass murderer, but is he an idiot?
No.
Yeah.
So he says this in 1974, a year after the Yom Kippur War and
Yes.
the oil crisis.
Yes. You know, sometimes gall and audacity are masking desperation. But I also think he believes this. And I don't just think he believes this. I think he believes his parents believed it. And I think he believes his grandparents believed it. And you know why? Because they did. And because it makes sense. Yeah. Yes, he's also 2 years after the Munich Olympic massacre. And he's, I think, just after or just before the Ma'alot massacre, when members of the DFLP came out of Lebanon, took over an Israeli school, and massacred 22 kids. So yes, he is the anti-colonialist, fighting the Algeria fight, coming to the UN and telling us we have 75 years of evidence that Zionism is imperialism, is colonialism, is neo-colonialism, and is racism. This is also, of course, the Zionism is racism resolution. Right? Is happening right then. Okay? Everybody with me? Yes. All right. Zionism used imperialism, or empires, or whoever the heck was powerful in their day. Herzl tried to get into the Sultan. I don't know if you know, but the Ottoman Empire was imperial. List also, very much so. Folks, Zionism used it. But was it it? The Jews used the powers that be. Were they the powers that be? No. Why not? One good indication that should have given Palestinian intellectuals pause, but never did, was that the empire kept changing. If the empire keeps changing, the best example of that is the revolt against the British in 36 to 39 that leaves them much less ready to fight in 48, and the Jews are much more ready to fight in 48, and the Jews don't disappear when the British disappear. Because the whole theory of the Great Revolt is that if you get rid of the British, you get rid of the Jews. What if the Jews are using the British, as any small people will of the great empire of the day, rather than they are an actual arm of the British? What if the Jews were just taking the guns from the Czechs because there weren't other guns? Truman recognized Israel in 11 minutes, but Israel, for the entirety of the 48 war, is under an American arms embargo. I don't know if you heard that in your Zionism classes in American Hebrew school. So they take communist weapons. That's what they got. Are they Soviet? The Jews are not German imperialists. The Jews are not Russian imperialists. They're literal refugees from the Tsar, who the Tsar finds useful to make subjects when they're in the Ottoman Empire to try and curtail a little bit of power away from the Ottomans in any place he can. France, during the Algeria conflict, becomes deeply and closely connected to Israel. The French even signal to the Arabs that we are no different from the Zionists, which is not a great compliment to Zionism. But are they actually different from the Zionists? The French can leave and the Zionists never seem to manage to. And then in 1970, roughly, America becomes the great backer of Israel, for reasons having to do as much with geopolitics as love, because if it was love, it would have started earlier. And now the Palestinians are convinced to this very day that that imperial support is the only reason. I said to you, why doesn't it work? Why doesn't the anti-colonial struggle work against the Jews? It worked against so many others. And we all understood, because we're Jews and we're very smarmy and convinced we know everything, that obviously it didn't work because we have nowhere to go. But the Palestinians have an answer that doesn't require them to recognize that we have nowhere to go. What's their answer? There's always some empire or another backing them up, some patron or another backing them up. What is happening on your college campuses? The anti-Israel campaign on college campuses, the BDS movement, and every branch of it and everything that preceded it, flows. Some of its ideological underpinnings come from the Soviet period and Soviet propaganda and all that. That's all true. But that's not the main reason. It flows from Palestinian civil society. Palestinians started the BDS movement at Durban in 2001. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up. And the Palestinian elites in the West guide this movement, give it its language, give it its strategy. And what is the strategy? Why obsessively campaign against Israel and Zionism in the West? Other than that you're bigots, which maybe you're bigots, but you don't have to be bigots. Why does it make sense? Yeah. Stay close. Stay inside the topic. You want to go far, and it is connected to everything. You want to weaken Israel? You, the resistance, weaken it from inside. We, the diaspora, we're going to take care of the great patron. There's always a great patron. And when we disconnect America from Israel, what happens to Israel? That's 100 years of history. We know that to be true. 100 years of evidence we know to be true. Time after time, it is literally our historical experience. There's always an empire. And then I would come to say to them, but it's always a different empire. Those clever Jews, maybe you're missing the weight of Jewish strength and resilience being internal to the Jews. But if the weight of Jewish strength and resilience is internal to the Jews, they have to actually talk to me, and they don't want to talk to me because of sunk costs. So they're going to find another empire, and they're going to detach us from it. And what if it works? Do we disappear? Do we evaporate? Do we no longer have a nuclear arsenal, allegedly according to foreign reports? What happens to us? Do we go back to Baghdad? It's the same basic problem. And it's at the heart of the internal Palestinian elite's discussion of us. Colonialism. I've told you about this footnote. It's time I tell you about the footnote. Remember the footnote? Yeah. By the Israeli geographer who's anti-Zionist and colonialist, anti-Zionism is colonialism, and he's anti-Zionist. And the footnote itself. I found it. You ready? Everybody emotionally ready? This is going to be wonderful. Alex Jacobson from the book I mentioned earlier put me onto this as well. Zionism is pure colonialism. Pure colonialism. With some differences. The differences are, this is a quote, Zionism's nature as an ethnic and national rather than economic project. Otherwise, it's totally colonialism. The refugee status of most of the Jews who came to Palestine. Otherwise, Zionism is colonialism. The loose organization of Jewish diaspora communities as opposed to well-organized colonial mother countries. Or if you're a college student, metropole. And lastly, the ideal of the return to Zion, single quotes, which is grounded in Jewish tradition. That is literally the footnote. Zionism is definitely colonialism, with the exception, I'm going to quote my great teacher, Alex Jacobson, In other words, Zionism was a colonialist phenomenon in all respects and fully resembled other examples of modern colonialism, apart from the fact that it was a national movement, that it was not motivated by desire for economic gain, that it arose out of Jewish suffering and was realized by people who may be defined as refugees, that the settlers had no colonial mother country, and that the bond with the land of Israel was part of the traditional historic identity of the Jewish people. Otherwise, it is totally colonialism. Why is this important? What does Zionism feel like to Palestinians? When Palestinians say, you're imperialist, you're colonialist, when Yasser Arafat gives this speech, this is a beautiful quote, I'm sorry, I have to say it. The Jewish national home came into existence at the point of British bayonets. It is definitely an imperialist project. I think that's Ilan Pape, by the way. I just love it so much, that quote, because it's so colorful, you know? Definitely, that is definitely what happened. And then the British turned on us and we still didn't disappear. Zionism's colonialism is important. It's an important part of this story. And it's an important and true and honest and earnest belief of Palestinian elites to this day. And it is what makes it's what makes it very hard to push forward into other kinds of engagement with us. Because in their experience, there were these three recurring themes at every step for a century. The three themes, folks, are the betrayal of the Arab and Islamic world. Israel and Palestine become, in this Islamic discourse, in this Arab discourse, and in this Palestinian discourse, the symbol of Islamic weakness, the symbol of Islamic retreat, the symbol of the failure of Islam to meet the modern age, which is why the Muslim world does not march for the genocide of Assad. And it does not speak out or cry or scream or shout for what happened in Yemen, 250,000 dead, mass starvation. At this very moment in Sudan, 1.5 million people are displaced. The Muslim world doesn't care. Because that's not telling a story about them. That's just telling a story about what's screwed up in Sudan. But the Israeli-Palestinian encounter for a century is a story about Islam and the weakness of Islam and the betrayal of Arab politics and the betrayal of that Islamic weakness and how pathetic it is to be on the retreat because the Jews are refugees. If they were to discover that the Jews are not in fact imperial agents of powerful Western empires, but pathetic refugees, which they secretly knew, as we saw from the father of the Mufti, then it's even worse. As Rashid Rida clarifies for us, better to be pushed back by a great empire than by the dregs of humanity running away from pathetic pogromists. And so the story of Islamic renewal is the story of Israel-Palestine. That energy in the Muslim world, that energy in Islamic intellectual discourse, that energy in the Arab nationalist story, in pan-Arab nationalist story, and in the specific Palestinian nationalist story, is why Hamas is popular even when it's hated. It's why the Arab world is obsessed with us. It's why the former Prime Minister of Malaysia, Dr. Mahathir Mohamad, can't stop talking about Israeli Jews who he's never met. Why would a Malaysian Prime Minister care about Israeli Jews? Because it's actually a vocabulary for talking about Islam and the place of Islam in history. And if you are sensitive to third world discourse, if you think of third world discourse as colonized versus colonizer, as oppressed versus oppressor, that's why academia is obsessed with Israel. Even when it's inconvenient. Because you really should worry about all the dead people and all the things, your academia. But no, Israel is the big story because Israel is the symbol. Is Islam, the Muslim world's discourse about us, isn't just anti-Semitic. It's deep and it's powerful and it makes sense. And the Palestinians are still going to lose this thing because it's still diagnostically an incorrect understanding of us. It drives them to policies, to strategies that they are guaranteed to fail, to dislodge us, to remove us, until we have somewhere to go. One of my favorite points about those college campus kids screaming decolonization because they read 2 paragraphs out of Frantz Fanon in some class. What's adorable about them screaming decolonization, what are they actually trying to say? I don't think they're hurting me. By the way, I think they're hurting you. They know Israelis can't hear them. So it's about American Jews and detaching American Jews. It's anti-Semitism toward you. It has nothing to do with me because it literally can't affect me. But what are they actually screaming? What are they trying to, what kind of thinking are they trying to attach themselves to? They don't even understand that they're attaching themselves to all of these vast misdiagnoses of Palestinian history that have run through from the very beginning. I don't have time for any more. And the solution is Dr. King. Okay, questions? I don't have time, but I'm sorry. One sentence on Martin Luther King.
What?
Martin Luther King is the solution. That's the piece. You ready? We're going to solve the conflict, and it's going to take 3 minutes. Here we go. Dr. Martin Luther King was a very clever man. I didn't know that at first. When I was a high school student in Glendale, Wisconsin, I was forced by my AP American history teacher, little flex, to read about Dr. King. And I was very annoyed by Dr. King because he was speechifying and he was very sweet and very clever. And I'm the son of a rabbi, so I appreciated that he was a religious leader. But you guys are really making too much of the guy. I am a cynical know-it-all. And then I actually read Dr. King, and I fell madly in love with him. Not because he's a great spiritual leader. We got those a dime a dozen, and they're usually wrong. We in Israel, at least. I don't know about America. But because he was a phenomenal strategist. Dr. King marched in the South. And the marches in the South weren't going anywhere. Until he had an insight. He does not believe in nonviolence. He believes in something he called coercive nonviolence. He believes deeply and profoundly in the power of violence, just not his own, in the power of the other guy's violence. And so he went looking in the South for sheriffs, for police departments, for local governments who would respond to a march by Black American activists and their allies, including many Jews, with massive violence. He needed the violence. He went to Selma, and he went to Birmingham, and he went to places that he specifically sought out. Places where there would be a violent response. Where the sheriff, whether he was racist or not, and most were, it's 1950s America, in the South. But most sheriffs in the South thought that their main job was to keep the peace in the streets. You don't have to like the protesters, you have to keep the peace in the streets. But he needed the sheriffs who thought that their main job was to show the black man his place. He needed them. And he went to them. And they served their role beautifully. I hope he sent them flowers. And with the violence that he instigated on the other side through his nonviolence, he forced the story of justice onto the television screens of white America. Injustice is hard to see as a specific thing you can grab hold of. It's long, it's slow, you get used to it. So you need to make the injustice powerful and immediate and painful and unlook-awayable. New adjective. And you do that by the violence of the other side as a response to your nonviolence. And by doing that, King forced a conversation in white America because it became unpleasant, untenable, and therefore had to change. And then King went to the mall and he gave his I Have a Dream speech. And everybody remembers what line from I Have a Dream? My 4 little will not be judged by the color of their... Yes. And everybody remembers that part because it's adorable, because little kids are adorable. I have 4 little kids, and I hope they live in a world in which they will not be judged by the color of their skin, which is kind of beige, and by the... It's adorable, but that's not the heart of the speech. You know what the heart of the speech is? The check. Read the speech. Watch the speech. I have been given a promissory note by the founders of America, and I have gone to the Bank of Liberty and I have tried to cash it. He did it better. Just watch the original video. I refuse to believe that it came back marked insufficient funds. What's his point to America?
You owe us.
Not you owe us. Not just you. Why do you owe us? Yeah, you promised us, you promised you. What's his argument? His argument is, I don't need you to be something else. I need you to be you. If you were the you think you are, we'd be done here. If you were the you claim to be, you tell your kids you are, we're good. We have freedom and equality. I have come to the Bank of Liberty. Make sure my check can cash. Make sure there's enough liberty for the promise that you made to be kept. You slave-owning promisers of freedom. Make sure that that check can be cashed. Be who you claim to be. There are 2 kinds of conflict. There are 2 kinds of conflict. There are zero-sum conflicts. If I win, you lose. If you win, I lose. I had better win. There are such conflicts. I think the conflict with the Nazis is a zero-sum conflict. They exist. And then there's another kind of conflict. Let's call it a tragic conflict. The conflict where every side has justice. Every side has a point. Every side wants something they deserve. And in those kinds of conflicts, those conflicts are not really, they're not really a kind of conflict, they're a psychology of the leadership of the conflict. What do I mean by that? In a zero-sum conflict, if I am all justice and you are all evil, and I come to you, and I say, let's compromise with your evil. I'm all justice on my side. I come. What happened when Chamberlain went to Munich? What happened to Chamberlain? What happens to a leader who goes to the other side that is all evil and wants to compromise with them? What happens to their own leadership?
Fails.
They are undermining themselves because the other side is absolute evil. You want me to compromise with absolute evil? What happens if the conflict is redefined not as a zero-sum conflict, but in fact as a conflict where the other side has a point? Obviously, 90% of the justice is on my side. I'm me. But there's 10% on the other side. What did King say about white America? By the way, in a debate, implicit and sometimes explicit, with Malcolm X. What did King say about white America? There's something over there I can negotiate with after 250 years of slavery and 100 years of Jim Crow, after finally fighting the bloodiest war in their history over slavery. But yet there's something over there I can negotiate with. There is a justice over there I can reach out to. Their story of themselves. And if in a tragic conflict, in a conflict with multiple sources of justice, a leader who goes across and reaches out to the justice of the other side, makes the case for the justice of the other side, creates more justice. It's not zero-sum. There isn't exactly 40 units of justice, and if one has one, then the other loses one. You can have 20 units here, 20 units here, and you end up with 80 units altogether. You reach out to the other side of a conflict that is multiple sources of justice, and you say, I'm not making peace with your crimes. I'm not making peace with your horrors. I'm not making peace with your mistakes. But I can make peace with the rest of you, with your story of yourself that is about liberty. That's kind of strange, having a story and identity about liberty. The American national identity being an idea of liberty. I can make peace with that. I can found a homeland in that. Take that model for 5 seconds and bring it into the Palestinian experience. Every single thing we have seen is about the Jews and the Arabs being in a zero-sum conflict. Everything the Jews get, the Palestinians lose. Everything the Palestinians get, the Jews lose. And it's nefarious, and it's foreign, and it can be wished away. With enough blood and gore and sacrifice, and it can be wished away. What if it can't be wished away? But not just if it can't be wished away. What if there's justice on the Jewish side? It doesn't have to be a lot of justice. Just enough to hold on to. What if I accept on the Jewish side, not that Zionism is true, not that this is their homeland, it's my homeland, but that they're refugees with nowhere to go. There are people in this world need to breathe the air of this earth. Isn't that enough to hold on to? Can I make peace with that? The Palestinian political problem today, vis-a-vis peace, and we talked about the long arc of the Israeli experience of the peace process on the bus. Why Israelis think that they tried, and it collapsed in rivers of blood, time after time after time. Again, I'm not saying that's the entirety of the historical, objective historical truth, but that is deeply the Israeli Jewish experience. But what if, okay, if you are Hamas, and you say, I'm in a zero-sum conflict, if I reach across the aisle, I will be undermined. What's the problem with the peacemakers of Palestine? What's the problem with Yasser Arafat when he went to Oslo? The Yasser Arafat of 1974, that speech, who then goes to Oslo, what's he making peace with? What's he making peace with?
Unjust enemy.
Colonialism and imperialism and racism and neocolonialism. He undermined himself. Why is Mahmoud Abbas profoundly hated? Because he's a dictator? Hamas are worse dictators. They're not hated. Why is Mahmoud Abbas hated? Because what? Because his own argument about himself is that he's Chamberlain. When the Palestinians learn our story, when they learn what you learned on Thursday, they don't lose this experience, but they see sifting through the clouds of that experience, the Jewish experience on the other side. And they learn the holes in their experience, that it doesn't invalidate what they went through. But there's more to the story. None of their story is a lie. None of their thinking is stupid. But there's just more. And when they learn that more, there's something to hold on to. And you don't have to be a Chamberlain to make that peace. And by the way, King was not polite. King was not gentle. There is a profoundly coercive, nonviolent Palestinian strategy. The Jews are founding settlements, found a bunch of settlements. What are the Jews going to do? Take you down from the mountaintops? Found more. What are they going to do now? Take you down again? Nobody shoots, nobody throws a punch. How quickly before the Israeli left is back? There is a Palestinian strategy, but it begins and ends with seeing the rest of the story, of their story, the rest of their story about us. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful time in Israel.